Presented by CP Plus Security Made Simpler in association with HP Ink Advantage Wireless Printers. Hindware, bathrooms you keep admiring.
The idea to declare an emergency came from Siddharth Shankar Ray.
Yes, Siddharth Shankar Ray.
So he is the architect.
He was the architect.
I have compared that period under the British rule. What Indira Gandhi did was worse even than that.
We have learned one lesson that you should never take independence or freedom for granted.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of To The Point. Today is the 40th anniversary of the emergency, and it was undoubtedly the most traumatic experience in independent India's history. But for the majority of Indians alive today, it's something they know little about and have precious little understanding of. So tonight, in a special one-hour episode, we discuss what was the emergency, why did it happen, how much responsibility and blame lies with Indira Gandhi and her son Sanjay, how did our critical institutions respond, and what led to the emergency's end. But tonight we're also going to ask other questions. Why did the Janata government elected with such hope and goodwill fail? And finally, what has this 3-year episode taught us about the Indian voter and his commitment to democracy? I have with me an unparalleled collection of guests. They are the best-known historian of modern India, Ramchandra Guha, the author of a new book on the emergency, Kumi Kapoor, the well-known Times of India and pioneer columnist Swapan Das Gupta, one of Indira Gandhi's most renowned biographers, Zarir Masani, the Gardner Professor of History at Harvard University, Shogato Bose, and former Congress Minister and Gandhi family loyalist, Mani Shankar Iyer. Before we come to details and specifics, let's try and see if we can agree on a big, broad picture of the emergency. Zarir Masani, would you accept that the emergency was perhaps the most traumatic experience in independent India's history?
Yes, I think it was undoubtedly the most traumatic experience. I think it's an experience which has lingered in the memory, although many people are born today, have been not, who were not born at the time are sort of running things today. But I do think it's a warning to governments in the future, and it is a major landmark which we, I think, rightly commemorate.
Kumi Kapoor, the cold facts of the emergency are chilling. 34,988 people were detained under the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, 75,818 arrested under the Defence of India rules. Practically the entire opposition was arrested, the press censored, the constitutional brutally amended, and even the judiciary accepted that the right to life had been suspended. What was India like during those 21 months?
It was for us a very dark and surrealistic period. We'd seen this sort of thing in the movies and read about it in books, but we never thought it could happen back home. We'd taken democracy so much for granted.
So,
of course, some people it affected personally, and others only later on came to know the full extent of how civil liberties were being eroded.
But would you say, Kumi Kapoor, that it was an episode that left its dark imprint upon all those who lived through it?
I think the impact was much more in North India than it was in the South, which shows in the election results as well. But those who felt it personally, yes, it did leave a very sharp impact.
Swapan Das Gupta, would you agree with the comment that L.K. Advani made in his diary, that at the height of the emergency, he feared that maybe Indian democracy was over and done with? Did you share that fear during that time?
Well, certainly in the course of those 19 months, a lot of us, and I must confess that I spent most of the time overseas, but I think a lot of us felt that because the emergency had been carried through with such ruthless efficiency, that it had encountered only sporadic opposition and that mostly the establishment of the country was singing praises and hosannas to both Indira Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi, and bending over backwards to change the very constitutional structure on which the Indian democracy had been premised. I think a lot of people feared the worst, and that this was going to be something which was going to endure for a very long time.
Let's then come to specifics. And Shaukat Bose, let's start with the first explanations of why the emergency happened. Would you today accept that it was declared to protect Indira Gandhi's political career after the Allahabad High Court had struck down her election and after the Supreme Court had only given her a conditional stay? In other words, her future and her career were the reasons why the emergency was imposed.
Yes, the proximate cause was obviously the threat to her political career and the Allahabad High Court decision that she could not contest elections for 6 months. But of course, she had lost popularity between 1972, when she was at her very peak, and 1974 for a variety of reasons. There was corruption in Bihar. There was a serious political challenge in Gujarat. The day before the emergency was imposed, election results poured in from the state of Gujarat, where an opposition coalition won. And I think she was also beginning to be rather paranoid about strong leaders within her own party, those who had implemented her populist socialist program of Garibi Hatao. It is a bit surprising because in the state of UP in 1971, Indira Gandhi's Congress party had won 49% of the vote, and yet there was this paranoia by 1975 following the challenges in Gujarat and Bihar. Okay. But yes, the proximate cause was that she did not want to take the judicial route to challenge the Allahabad High Court decision. The Supreme Court had given a very conditional reprieve, and therefore the imposition was imposed on this day 40 years ago.
Zureen Masani, you heard Shaukat Bose there give a much broader answer to my specific question: was the emergency a direct result of one woman's political career being threatened? Let me put to you what Indira Gandhi used to say at the time about why she was forced to declare the emergency. She claimed that the opposition was trying to paralyze the government. She pointed to the fact that just a couple of hours before the declaration, Jayaprakash Narayan had called upon the armed forces and the police to disobey orders. Was there any credibility to those arguments advanced by Indira Gandhi at that time? Or would you say they were nothing more than trumped-up excuses?
I think the specific accusations were excuses, but I think we shouldn't over-personalize the crisis. I think there was a structural political crisis, which was the transition of India from being a one-party state, which it had effectively been since independence, to becoming what it is today, which is a multi-party state. And I think Indira was part of that transition, and she did her best to maintain the one-party state. When she came to power, it was just before the 1967 general election, when opposition parties like the Swatantra and the Jansangh made a major showing in parliament, and there was every indication that the 1971 general election, had there not been a Congress split and had Indira not tried to reinvent the Congress, would have resulted in an opposition majority. So she staved off that. She kept the Congress as a one-party dominant government. And I think she was trying to do the same in 1975, when it looked as though she was going to lose the 1976 general election. Because as Shaukat rightly pointed out, she had lost so much popularity. But it was structural, so I think it was a necessary stage that would have a bumpy transition at some point from a one-party state to a multi-party state.
I want to bring you in on that particular debate, Swapna, before I move on, because I think it's a critical debate and it concerns the understanding of the emergency that we're trying to convey to the audience. 2 days ago, R.K. Dhawan, in an interview to this program, said that in fact it was the build-up of political events in the preceding 3 years before 1975. He cited things like the railway strike, L.N. Mishra's death in January, as well as the manner in which the opposition could never reconcile itself to Indira Gandhi's victory that led progressively to the declaration of the emergency. Do you accept that? Or do you think that those are just convenient excuses that are trumped up to cover up the fact that one woman and her career was under threat?
You know, I think it's very important to recognize how the atmosphere was as perceived by Indira Gandhi and the circles around Indira Gandhi. I think it would be fair to say that at that point in time, particularly from about 1973-74, Indira Gandhi was living in what might loosely be called a leftist bubble, which saw itself as being constantly under siege. There is a reference somewhere, I can't remember, of Sharda Prasad having told his son that she feared the fate of Allende. Later, the Communist Party was to say that it was a preemptive strike against the counter-revolutionary forces. So I think in their own minds, at a time when the mismanagement of the economy caused not least by the exaggerated nationalizations at that period had taken shape and had led to a lot of resistance and structural problems. I think at that time Indira Gandhi was believed almost sincerely that there was a sinister plot, and which probably explains what is there in Kumi's book. Siddharth Shankar Ray, having actually prepared a quasi-declaration of emergency document including what needs to be done much prior to the Allahabad High Court judgment. So I think Allahabad High Court judgment acted as a trigger to an existing set of paranoia which was there in the circles around Indira Gandhi.
Ram Gua is joining us at this moment. Ram Gua, I introduced you as the best-known historian of modern India. You weren't with us at that moment. I want to put to you the key issue that we're debating and discussing at the moment before we then move on to other issues. Do you believe that an emergency would have happened regardless of the fact that Indira Gandhi's election got challenged and the Supreme Court only gave her a conditional stay? Was her attitude to the opposition, was the development of events such as the killing of Ellen Mishra, the railway strike, the attitude of the opposition pushing her into an attitude where an emergency was becoming almost inevitable?
Well, clearly there was an increasing confrontation between the government and the opposition. But I think it was very much a personal decision. Of course, she was egged on by her advisors and sycophants like Siddharth Shankar Ray. But if you study the Allahabad court judgment, Karan, which I've done, she was actually convicted on very trivial grounds. For example, one of the grounds, there were two grounds. One was that Yashpal Kapoor had been appointed an election agent before his resignation was accepted from the government. Secondly, the podium she was speaking on was too high. Now, I think she would have won an appeal in the Supreme Court, except that the Supreme Court said, at the time the appeal was being heard, she could not act as Prime Minister. Now, clearly she was extremely paranoid and did not trust anyone else in the Congress party, because if she had stepped aside and let somebody else in the cabinet, somebody senior in the cabinet, Swaran Singh, shall we say, or Jagjeevan Ram, be Prime Minister, she would have probably won an appeal. But I think there was a kind of, she, by temperament, she was insecure, she trusted very few people. From a very early age, she felt her aunts were against her, now she felt the world were against her. Her relations with JP were extremely fraught for a very long time. And then, she was advised to take this extraordinary step. But it was clear that it was really only to save her seat after the judgment. I mean, you could talk, I don't know whether you have a lawyer on this panel, Karan, but my sense is that she was convicted on flimsy grounds and it would have been overturned on appeal if she'd been patient enough.
All right, let's move on. Let's move beyond this debate about why the emergency was declared, whether it was entirely because of one woman's career being under threat or whether there were other forces that made for it. Let's come instead to the way India received it. Professor Bose, Kuldeep Nair, a great journalist at that time, someone who lived through the emergency, says that one of the most striking things was the lack of popular resistance. He says India literally gave in. Was that because the country was taken by surprise, or was it because at this critical moment of test, we as a people lacked the spine to resist?
Well, there was no popular resistance initially, particularly during the first year of the emergency. But I have to say that the entire, opposition was put into prison. Opposition leaders, opposition activists, and the lack of resistance also shows that the threat actually was not as severe in June 1975, the political challenge that is, that was made out to be. There were three major pillars of Indian democracy that faced an onslaught: the opposition parties, a free press, and I have to say that there were many editors and journalists who played a very brave role, even if some were cowed into submission. But what was the most disappointing at that time was that the judiciary did not stand up to the imposition of the emergency.
Sure.
And the decision that was handed down on the habeas corpus case was in fact quite appalling. So it is true that there was no popular resistance, but I think disaffection gained ground during the second year of the emergency, when you had Sanjay Gandhi's brigade leading the forced sterilization drives in North India.
Answer the question specifically rather than spread yourself, because then we'll have an unstructured discussion. Forgive me interrupting you, but let's be specific, because we're talking to an audience that doesn't know and we want to inform them. Let's come, Kumi Kapoor, to in fact the Sanjay Gandhi episode that Professor Bose was beginning to talk about. The emergency saw him emerge as clearly the second most important person in the country. He exercised enormous power, and there were stories at the time that he had a hold of some sort over his mother. As someone who's just written a book on the emergency, why did Sanjay become so powerful, and what was the nature of the relationship with Indira Gandhi whereby she tolerated her son, who had no political position, virtually running the country at times?
Well, the reason is difficult to say. Only the mother and son would know clearly what it was. You can only speculate. But one thing was clear, that by the middle of the emergency, all the key decisions were being taken not by the Prime Minister's secretariat, but from the Prime Minister's residence, and basically by the small group which surrounded Sanjay Gandhi, and Mr. Dhawan was the implementer. And the files were being sent after the decisions had been taken by the Sanjay Kotri to Om Mehta or other ministers for their and Mrs. Gandhi for their signatures.
Now you have a story in your book that illustrates the enormous power and influence Sanjay acquired. You recount his treatment of Indira Gandhis, who was Information and Broadcasting Minister at the time, and virtually within 24 hours of the emergency being declared, he scolded Gujral and had him removed. Recount for the audience briefly why Sanjay was so upset with Gujral and what followed.
Actually, Gujral was the first ministerial casualty of the government, and Sanjay's dislike for him was before the emergency was officially imposed, because Gujral was trying to follow rules and regulations and was a gentleman. So Sanjay was furious when the 20th June rally was not covered live by TV, because it was against the rules and Gujral didn't allow it. He was also upset over the fact that the AIR did not report the Supreme Court stay on Mrs. Gandhi's election in the manner that, the favorable manner that he had expected. Okay. So he met, Gujral met Sanjay Gandhi in the corridors and shouted at him and said, "You don't know how to do your job." When the emergency was actually imposed,
we are losing the line to you, Kumi. We're losing the line to you. I'll come back to you, but the line to you is breaking up. Okay. I'm sorry, I'll have to move on. We'll come back to you with a clearer line. Let's come, Zarir Masani, to the two big campaigns that Sanjay launched and with which he is most closely associated. The first, of course, is the sterilization campaign. Zarir Masani, for audiences who don't know it and weren't around, how would you explain the sterilization campaign and the incredible traumatic impact it had, particularly in northern India?
Well, it had its roots in earlier family planning campaigns. population explosion was an issue before Sanjay came along. He developed a particularly coercive approach to it, and his attitude was rather sort of from on high, the poor are breeding too much, we need to, whether they like it or not, curtail their fertility. And the campaign, particularly in Delhi, where he was very closely involved, involved quite a lot of very random, well, not so random, because people were paid to bring in hundreds of people to be sterilized. And this caused huge resentment, particularly among the Delhi Muslim community, who had been, traditionally supportive of Congress. It also spread out across the country, particularly in the Hindi belt. I think in the south it was much more sanely administered, and I believe some southern chief ministers turned a blind eye to it. So I think it was hugely unpopular, and unfortunately it got population control a very bad name, because I happen to think it's an important issue, but because of its identification with Sanjay and the emergency, it's become a no-go area since then.
Ram Guha, the second campaign with which Sanjay was most closely associated, and in a sense his name got branded across it, was Slum Clearance, particularly typified with what happened at Turkman Gate in Delhi. Would I be right in saying that this was a callous attempt to beautify Delhi by demolishing the homes of the poor and banishing them to far-flung colonies like Trilokpuri, where there was virtually no proper housing and perhaps no amenities either?
No, very much so. It was a kind of utopian, megalomaniac plan allegedly cleaning up and beautifying Delhi, in which Sanjay's right-hand man was Jagmohan, who was then with the DDA, and who in a poem he wrote during the emergency called himself the houseman of Delhi. I mean, houseman being the 19th century French urban planner who cleaned up Paris. So there were extraordinary delusions that Sanjay and admittedly even his henchmen like Jagmohan had.
So would you say that in fact the combination of slum clearance and sterilization are going to be in a sense the legacy with which Sanjay will be remembered, and in a sense his I suppose contribution is the wrong word, but his nefarious association with the emergency?
Yes. I think, Karan, in my view, Sanjay Gandhi is the closest independent India has got to a fascist. It's not just the programs of slum clearance and sterilization, the way they were implemented, the crowd of goons around him, some of whom went on to play notorious roles in the anti-Sikh riots of 1984. Some of whom were ministers in the last UPA government. So, he was the closest we got to a fascist, who was ruthless, amoral, used state power and extra state power, Gundagiri as we would call it, in a very focused and organized way.
Let's come to the two institutions that in a sense are accused of having buckled under the emergency at the time. Manishankar Iyer, although individual high courts were willing to entertain PILs, the Supreme Court, famously or infamously, actually came around to accepting that under the emergency, even the right to life had been suspended. Looking back now from the vantage point of 40 years down the road, would you say that was perhaps the lowest moment in India's judicial history?
Look at the Constitution today. It still has Part 18, which is described as emergency provisions. It would appear that from our founding fathers onward till today, there has been a belief that there could be a genuine internal emergency, and therefore that internal emergency would have to be met with very special measures. And despite the changes that have been made to that chapter by the Janata government,
you're not answering my
they're
question.
Still there. They're there in the Constitution.
Mani, you're not answering my question.
No,
I'm not questioning whether the emergency exists as a constitutional provision. I'm asking whether the Supreme Court accepting that under the emergency even the right to life had been suspended represented the lowest moment in our judicial history.
I cannot possibly give a judgment that is superior to that of the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court believed that everything had been suspended at that time, including all our fundamental rights, including the right to life, then that was the that was the constitutional position. Whether anybody's life was taken, or whether people should have been put into jail in the manner in which they were, or whether the programs of Sanjay Gandhi should have been run in the manner in which they were, I think all those were huge political mistakes, and she paid a big price for those political mistakes. But it would appear that the Constitution did provide for an emergency, which did provide for these rights to be suspended, and that the Supreme Court upheld that interpretation of the Constitution then. I fear that if there were to be an emergency again, the Supreme Court might take the same position.
Very quickly, Swapna Das Gupta, on that particular point, whether that decision by the Supreme Court represents the lowest moment in our judicial history, or whether, as Mani argues, it's justified by the fact that the provision for an emergency is a constitutional provision. Do you want to come in with a contrarian viewpoint?
Yeah, well, I think Mani just epitomizes what Mr. Advani said the other day about the complete lack of contrition on the part of the Congress. And I think it's important to remember that that Supreme Court judgment of 1976 was actually preceded by an attempt, what might be called, which Mr. Huxer used to call the committed judiciary, and the supersession of judges, which led to Justice A.N. Ray becoming the Chief Justice. Now, I think what really happened was that was a bespoke judgment given far in excess of what was necessarily true of just the Constitution necessitated. Because one particular article of the Constitution has to be read with other sections of the Constitution. It has to be read keeping in mind the circumstances of the moment. And I think what Justice A.N. Ray in the majority judgment said is that the Parliament has passed that law, the Parliament has passed the Constitution Amendment, the Emergency Declaration. That is in accordance with certain ideas of the Constitution. The Constitution has not been changed, therefore what they say is right. It was this literalist interpretation which Justice Bhagwati, who was one of the majority judgment, was later to say that he apologized publicly, rather late in the day I would say, for giving a judgment. I would say that that judgment was not really a judicial judgment, it was a judgment which was basically a political one, and it was a made-to-order judgment, which suggested at that time that the judiciary during the emergency was not really a free and fair judiciary.
Very, very quickly, Ram Guha, L.K. Advani, speaking about the other institutions that buckled, said famously off the press, you were asked to bend, you ended up crawling. With the exception of the very beginning when papers like The Statesman and the Indian Express attempted to resist, would you accept that thereafter the press buckled under? Or is that an unfair comment because there was free censorship and how could they have done anything else?
No, I think the mainstream press buckled under, but there were some brave little journals. For example, Romesh Thapar closed down Seminar. Himmat, which was edited by Rajmohan Gandhi, tried in various ways to resist it. There's a wonderful article by Kalpana Sharma yesterday in the, online about this. So the smaller journals tried, but overall, except for The Statesman and the Indian Express, the mainstream English language media completely buckled under, and Mr. Advani is right in that regard.
All right, let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to ask three critical and intriguing questions. Why did Indira Gandhi call elections which led to her losing and the emergency being closed down? What sort of government did Janta provide and did it succeed? And why did it fail after just 3 years? And then, what does that 3-year period teach us about the Indian voter? Is he or is she the real hero of restoring democracy?